All right, welcome to the ODIN breakout room at After Town Hall. Today is Wednesday, June 26th, is that right? 7th, and 26th, maybe my clock is wrong. And we are talking today about the use of Sociocracy 3.0 and consent-based decision-making to shape the governance process of creating a Cardano Constitution. And this is being put on by the ODIN community. We've been exploring and talking about S3 patterns and how they're used to enable a bunch of good stuff in decentralized communities for how to collaborate, how to do governance, how to make sure all voices are heard. We thought we would have a conversation today around how those principles could be applied to the process of creating a Cardano Constitution. So I shared a document in chat that kind of shapes some of the initial questions around this. But just quick show of hands, how many people here are aware of what S3 is? To Jeremy. Or maybe I should say, who doesn't know what S3 is? Lucas? Anybody else? I can do a very quick intro to S3 at a very high level, if that would be helpful. And then maybe we can get into the main meat of the conversation. Okay, so let me start with that. I'm going to share my screen here. And really, this is just using the materials provided by the S3 group themselves. It was created by a gentleman named James Priest and Bernhard Buckelbrink. And there's also a woman named Lily who's part of that team. And it's really an open framework for evolving agile and resilient organizations. And their tagline is effective collaboration at any scale. It's principles-based, so they have a whole bunch of great principles that guide a lot of the patterns. It's flexible. They're adaptable patterns that are fully independent, but they're mutually reinforcing. And that's what we're really finding in the S3 study group at ODIN is you can pick and bring in all the patterns you want that seem good. But as you dive deeper, the more patterns you bring in, the more they mutually reinforce each other, and it becomes more and more powerful the more of these patterns you adopt. And it's free. It's licensed under Creative Commons free culture license. And at a very high level, it's all about co-creation and evolution of an organization. And they have different areas where you can talk about peer development, co-creation enablers, building organizations, how to bring S3 into organizations, defining agreements, focused interactions, meeting practices, organizing work and organizational structure. And as a history, it kind of maps out the influences in history on sociocracy, but I guess the big one is what they call 1.0 is kind of came out of the Quaker meeting practices in the early 1900s and how they organized their circles and how they made decisions as communities. And then that kind of emerged into cybernetics and what they're calling sociocracy 2.0, and there's really a movement there around the sociocratic meeting principles, and that's really consent-based decision-making, and we'll get into that a bit. And then sometime after that, that was evolved into something called holacracy through Brian Robertson. And really, they took all of these things and they injected agile and lean software development thinking into the whole thing, and that kind of became the Sociocracy 3.0 movement in 2015. And they all build on each other. So if you're familiar with sociocracy itself, Sociocracy 3.0 makes a lot of sense. It builds on top of that, but codifies and maybe arranges the patterns in a different way. I'm going to skip this, but really get into, there are 7 principles that S3 is kind of formed around, and that's consent, equivalence, accountability, continuous improvement, transparency, effectiveness, and empiricism. And I'm just going to do 2 more slides to get into each of those. Effectiveness is really about devoting time to only what brings you closer towards achieving your objectives. Consent, do things in the absence of reasons not to. So that's really important, is really enabling speed and autonomy, but really checking in with the group to see if there are reasons not to take a specific action. Empiricism, test all assumptions through experiments, continuous revision and falsification. And then the last 4, continuous improvement, change incrementally to accommodate steady empirical learning, equivalence. So this one's important. People affected by decisions actually influence and change those decisions based on reasons to do so. And transparency, all information is available to everyone in an organization unless there is a reason for confidentiality. And then accountability, respond when something is needed, do what you agreed to, and take ownership for the course of the organization. So at a very high level, this is kind of what Sociocracy 3.0 is all about. I'm going to stop the share there at this point. And then we prepared this document where we wanted to bring some of these principles into the constitutional creation process, and or not bring it in, but to talk about whether that would be a good idea. Would it serve the community to start thinking along these lines? And I'm going to my share screen again. So here is the document. I'll drop the link into chat again. So you can follow along. And the goal here is not to set up a bunch of questions ahead of time, but to really seed the conversation. And it's really around questions about how S3 can help facilitate the difficult process of achieving consent in a decentralized process, which has its goal, the creation of the final draft of the Cardano Constitution by the end of the year. And these are all questions that were put in here by the ODIN community. And if you want to participate, feel free to add your own questions or thoughts here. And part of this document is we want this to be a living document where we have a conversation. So if you have thoughts on, say, this question, you could come in here. It's an open doc, so you can add a comment and start doing stuff here. But we're going to kick the process off here today just to get the kind of the community sense check on what you think of this whole process. And yeah, maybe I'll open it up there for any initial thoughts, reactions, things that people are thinking about, or all that, Jeremy. And just as a matter of process, yeah, since we are more than a couple people, if you want to jump in and have something to say, please raise your hand and we'll go in the order of things. But yeah, go ahead, Jeremy.
I just wanted to highlight right off the top how good the alignment is between S3 and what the Cardano interim constitution is trying to say. Like, right, it's not in the lead of the Constitution, but in all the documentation around it, including like the support videos they've made to explain what they're doing and things like that. They have this statement, which is, I wrote it down here, how to make sure everyone has a voice. And if you were to take sociocratic practice and identify like your absolute MVP statement about it, it's essentially that all objections in a polity of any kind are heard and resolved. Okay, so the heard is one thing. Everybody can say they're listening. Resolving objections proves that you're listening, right? This is how you prove that. And of course, S3 and sociocracy in general are filled with patterns for getting to the point where you can solve an objection or solve for an objection or help get the information to an objector that they need and things like that. So I just wanted to point that out right off the top.
Thanks, Jeremy. Yeah, I think those are really important points, and a nice kind of reflection on how some of the principles can map to what's in the provisional constitution already. And since we are like a decentralized community, and we're trying to design this way so that there's no like hierarchical power structure. The community can have their voice, everyone can be heard. I think it's really important to think about some of these principles. Yeah, Ken.
One of the key things in the sociocracy stuff is like having a primary driver. So like usually you're talking about an organization that has a specific goal in mind. And so I'm curious about what people think about whether or not there will be conflicting drives behind different people interacting in this process.
Yeah, Jeremy.
I think that like that's a really good point. It has to do, in my mind, with the concept of agency with any type of governance, because you've got like a polarity within that, a tension within that, and of course, sociocracy has great ways of dealing with tension and the concept of tension. But the polarities of that would be process orientation versus outcome orientation. And like the drivers and the intended outcomes and things like that, the idea of what kind of goals is a community setting, and can the community decide on its own goals? This is like roadmap and things like that. That is in tension with the idea of how do you get things done. So it's literally the governance part, right? So if you become very process oriented, you're going to find yourself on this spectrum, this tension spectrum. You're going to find yourself over provisioning for how you make decisions, which oftentimes leads to stagnation and things like that, a non-alive type of governance, versus when you become way more goal oriented, and then the governance tends to break down. There tends to be not as much governance, it tends to be under provisioned. You're really trying to dial it in based on what exactly it is that you're seeking when it comes to agency for participants in that community. And you have to recognize that like the Constitution itself is an agent within that system, right? We're giving it a principal job. So this is like principal agent theory. You're giving the Constitution a principal job. It's supposed to represent the agents in a very particular way, but it itself must be an agent within the larger ecosystem where people are doing things like setting goals, coming up with intended outcomes and things like that. So absolutely, there's going to be differences in the drivers, and we're going to have to negotiate that with process. We're going to have to negotiate that with governance.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Jeremy. And one of the things that I like about S3 is it has patterns that separate governance from operations. And the way they define that is governance is how do we decide on how we do things, and operations focuses on what we do, prioritizing that, and the getting stuff done. And it has patterns for all of that. So it's nice that they aren't like a single meeting isn't supposed to be conflated between deciding how we do things versus what we do. There's a separate governance meeting where we talk about that. And there's a backlog for all of that using agile principles, and they can be prioritized. And that's all done through consent mechanisms. And then the operational side, you have standard like agile backlogs of work items and projects and all that kind of stuff. And all those patterns are supported. And it's a nice way of clarifying things, because I think often, especially in the beginning and then the storming, before you get to the norming phase, there's a lot of conflating of how we do things versus what we need to do. And it really helps to clarify some of that stuff. Any other initial thoughts on how S3 might be able to impact the way we kind of govern the process of creating Cardano Constitution?
You know, does anybody have their hand up? It's interesting because just that idea of the governance versus the operational patterns in S3, and then which one could inform the process. Is it an operational thing, or is it a governance thing? I guess it might be a blend, but yeah, those principles, I think, especially the transparency. I'm looking at the Git book. I think I've got this. Yeah, their intersect docs, and that's kind of good because I'm still at that point of like, oh man, what's actually in the Constitution and what phase are we in? I'm eternally the newcomer, and trying to figure out like where I am, in the process and then how to play, my part, or how to participate, like what's being asked of me at the moment, etc. So I guess that's because the vote. Well, no, that was the council that just the vote just finished. Yeah, that's just sort of my thought.
Jose, what are your thoughts?
I've been thinking a lot about this, how to merge this sociocracy, governance and decision making with several parts of our governance, and how like the whole ethos of Cardano clicks so well with sociocracy. But so then what are the challenges? And so giving it some thought, one of the things that I'm kind of learning is that it is challenging to in some use cases. Like for instance, if you have a clear domain and you have a clear purpose and you have that clarity, like that very well defined purpose, then you can actually build a sociocratic organization that takes decisions once that is very clear. Because objections are not objections unless they refer to that purpose, right? So that common purpose or that mission. You can't just object because you don't like the weather, or because you don't like the color, or because whatever you want. And regarding the like for instance, we did have an incident trying to build a sociocratic constitutional committee member. So we were actually we had the intent of running for the ICC. And at the last meeting, we created this huge alliance with 3 big regions, with EMEA and Africa and LATAM. And it was just too complicated and too ambitious. And so at the last minute, we pulled out of that and the reason of that was that actually taking the right decisions for the constitutional committee member is different than taking the right decisions for a DREP, or is different than actually taking the right decisions for building the Constitution. So depending on the purpose, it has different different priorities and different complexities. Like for instance, in this one, I thought it would be easier because it's so clear. I mean, you need, like, the purpose of the ICC is to protect and uphold the Constitution. That's it. But then, even though it is clear, having a big group of people converge on understanding that and actually behaving coherently and being trained on the practices on time is far more complicated than it seems. And it actually puts in risk the quality of the decisions that you take. And it could put in risk the whole Cardano ecosystem if you are actually taking decisions with a bad governance system. So that was one thing. And regarding the Constitution, how the process of building Constitution, I'm struggling with figuring out how to actually divide the work. So it's permissionless. So like everyone would like to set up their own subcircles, and they would be free to like have their own subcircles. So let's say someone wants to discuss specifically the treasury parameters and treasury issues and policies that you would like to include in the Constitution. And then 5 groups think that they would do that as well at the same time. And maybe they don't even report to the same parent circle. So so the parent circles won't even know that they're actually delegating that same issue to two separate sub circles. And this will be big groups. This won't be a dozen people talking about it if we use this as a methodology. So I think that is a challenge to actually understand how to come together in different issues and who is going to work on what and what decisions are actually taking precedent over others, depending on how you delegate work. So I guess that's pretty much the main challenge I see, because it's not that clear. When you're actually building a constitution, you don't even agree on which are the main principles of the constitution. You have to actually go and agree on that beforehand. So before you can actually start work. So that could be a difficult thing to do. On the bright side, we will have a draft constitution that will be kind of the seed to spark the conversation. So, and hopefully we will have more than one. There's at least one that is coming from Intersect, but there might be others that we can use as an input. And then that could maybe kind of jumpstart the process of actually building an organization that could take better decisions.
Thanks, Jose. Those are all really great insights and points on the challenges and the benefits of introducing sociocracy into a process like this.
We are actually trying to experiment a little bit with creating a sociocratic DREP as well. So that has been fun.
Mm-hmm.
If anyone wants to, if interested, just reach out. We're happy to let you know a little bit more.
Yeah, and there are some live use cases that have proven effective at large scale. One thing that comes to mind, John Buck used to participate in his community in different places, and he's one of the big proponents of sociocracy and helped bring it into the English-speaking world. And he often refers to I think it's Kerala in India, as a children's congress, and they start with small sociocratic circles of children basically and teach them these principles, and they kind of make local decisions, and then they send representatives to a higher circle. And each circle is small. They're about 7 people or 8 people, but they go up, and he said they've successfully integrated like 180,000 participants in their sense making and everything in that kind of a structure. And he says it's an amazing kind of self-organizing kind of thing that is being done with basically children. There's no adults actually running this thing, and it's a children's congress. But it's using sociocratic principles, and it may be a great way of doing, like, at least initially, that kind of sensor mechanism to say, what are all the values that we need to be inclusive and gather and make sure we're thinking about, and feed them up, and then information can also be disseminated back down. So there may be ways of making that work, but it's always that training, getting people to understand how it works, all around the transparency and communication and responsibility and things like that. So I think there are patterns that can be brought to make it work, but it will require huge training as well, because it's not the way we naturally work, coming from kind of the legacy hierarchical corporate or organizational kind of stuff where there's a fixed hierarchy. And even Intersect internally is kind of, there's the board, and then there's the executive steering committee, and then there's committees, and then there's working groups and special interest groups, and it's kind of this pyramid of people. And how do we can we shift that around a bit so it's more collaborative, emergent, and really using some of these principles of organization and decision making. But specifically for the Constitution, I think it's a really great opportunity. We already have the constitutional conventions that we're committing to run in 50 different locations around the planet. How do we scale that up so that all of that information really enables us to make good decisions at the final convention?
Yeah, it's worth thinking about that, because circles are the scaling mechanism of sociocracy. That's how you get it to scale. And we, like, the Constitutional Convention is it anticipates that ability to scale, but it can't create the most, like, the grassroots layer of that. All it can do is present the top level of it, which is, I believe it's 50 delegates go to the ICC, which is actually a really big group if you think about it. But how could, and then that's being informed by, let's say, at least 10 people in every convention or every workshop, at least 10 people, maybe up to 20 or 25 or something like that. So that's smaller circles. So how could the people who attend those workshops be sort of the double link to even smaller, more spread out circles? Like, how can each member of a workshop bring its own like sub-circles information to that workshop to inform it even better?
Mhm.
And
Maybe
those are
there's-
skills. Yeah, and that's a skill. It's basically the BREP. You know, how to, and I guess this has to do with double linking. You know, how to go from a one circle, become a representative of that circle, and then work in the higher circle. And that's a skill. You know, that's a real trainable, learnable, measurable skill. You know what to, yeah. And it comes with a certain group of tasks and habits and sort of mindsets. Yeah, and it's not something that we get naturally, or I do from my upbringing. I feel that's like a skill that I'd want to practice, right? And sort of train, as opposed to, you know, like a training would be good.
I think it might also be an opportunity. Like, we're having these 50 local constitutional workshops. And within those, if you have like 20 people or 50 people and 10 of them are super passionate about this subtopic around the Constitution, maybe there is a way for them to not just disperse that energy once the workshop's over, but say we're intentionally building a local circle around this subtopic. And then if you have 20 of those around the planet, they could each send a rep to kind of a coordination circle that kind of brings all of their thoughts and inputs on a specific subtopic together. And those could feed into the Constitutional Convention. There may be ways to keep it going rather than these one-time workshops and then sending a delegate. It's this continuous conversation and intentional linking from different groups around the planet that are passionate about certain areas of this. I think it's an opportunity to help kind of shape the way we do the workshops and retain that value after. Because I noticed that with the SIP 1694 workshops, we got people together, they sent a delegate, but the community didn't continue to talk about SIP 1694 after that locally. It was one and done. And this might be a way to keep that energy going and keep the conversations and the inputs flowing.
Yeah, I think people would need to have, one of the things they would need to have would be confidence in the flow of information to some place it would be useful. So like the workshops can show that that's possible, but if they were to continue to keep that process alive and hopefully fracture it a little bit and get smaller groups that are able to better represent the thing, you know, to get more relevant within their smaller groups, to be sure that that information still is getting where it needs to go, which would be informing the ongoing maintenance of the Constitution as an open source project, which maybe is Intersect. I'm not sure I'm not sure, like, once the Constitution is ratified, like, what does the support structure for it look like at that point? Because it's not like you say, it's not the workshops anymore. So what is in place there? Does it have to be grassroots? Is there something like Intersect that can support that?
There are a number of structures in Intersect that could support that. One that comes to mind is the Membership and Community Committee, is really that interface between the corporate Intersect and the greater community part. And that could be a primary kind of link. There may be other groups around civics, might also be another good group since that's related. So there may be a way to have conversations with those groups and really see if there is a way to engage in this kind of.
And it's possible that Catalyst could be another part of that structure that allows information to travel up from the grassroots as well. Not sure how, but because it's going to be one of the largest treasury withdrawers, it makes sense that it's going to have voice. and so, you know, it's not that you want to tag along with the voice. That's not the goal here. But when you see that voice is being heard, you need to kind of get into that conversation and see if you can get in there.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. And that might be a really valuable bit to explore for Catalyst. I mean, because that was one of the original intents of the Catalyst Circle was to be a human sensor array, and bring in different viewpoints from the community. But there was no formal structure around those representatives and what their community actually was. But if it were like a set of local emergent grassroots circles that could then send delegates in, and that might be a really effective way of actually funneling real sensor data or concerns into a space where there can be conversations around this.
That's an interesting thing to think about. The one of the interesting things about the inability of the circle to sort of advance its mission was there was subcircles for several of those positions, but those subcircles were almost universally considered sort of invalid, illegitimate. And it's because like there was elected positions to the circle, which I suppose was the source of their legitimacy, but the subcircles were just, generally speaking, people who supported their double link, so to speak. So I wonder what we could learn from that. How those circles weren't considered legitimate, and if that was just a perception thing, were they actually legitimate, but it just wasn't well explored and wasn't well described and wasn't heard, or were they actually illegitimate, and we need a different process of going through that?
Actually, that definition of legitimacy is quite fuzzy sometimes. Like legitimacy means something for some people, something else for other people, and when there's rivalry and when there's politics and interests involved, that usually becomes a vector of attack your opponent because it's subjective. So maybe that could be something that as a community we could try to agree on what is actually being legitimate and what's not, so that it becomes less of a gray area and less easy to attack opponents based on that. We've already seen it a little bit on a couple of rounds before.
Yeah, that's such a key part of like what the ICC, what the interim constitution, what intersect all of these in Cardano Foundation, and talking about coming in and voting in Catalyst, for example, that concept of legitimacy is the key. If the individual perception, and it's 100% a perception thing, legitimacy is something you cannot control, but you can influence it. It's like you can't make the soil grow a plant, but you can water the soil, you can put it in a sunny spot, you can do the things to help the conditions for legitimacy to thrive, but you can't actually make something be legitimate. You can't go in and say, oh, I'm going to turn up the legitimacy dial and make this thing happen. It's too complex. And I think it's complex because there's so many polarities at work within it. You described like competition, and we could just look at that as like agent interest within the system. Some of that interest is pulling one way, some is pulling the other way. How in the world can these self-interests get along in a way where the governing body that you establish, and like this interim constitution is currently a governing body, how can that thing be seen as something that people will agree with the outcomes that are coming out of it? And that would be their propriety in agreeing with the legitimacy of the thing. So they'd be granting it that legitimacy bit by bit, piece by piece. And it's because everybody's going to be somewhere on those polarities. If you've got something like the liberty polarity, right? You've got this idea of what obstacles or constraints are in the way of what I can do in this ecosystem. An example of that's the actual protocol itself, the blockchain. You can only do what you can do on it, right? This is the can't do evil part of the thing. But there's also like the positive liberty aspect of it, which is, or I should say the negative liberty aspect of it, which is the idea that if there isn't something in place, if there isn't some rule there, then I have agency. I can do what I want in that spot. And so people are all at different locations along that spectrum. You know, they maybe want to be doing just the smart contract to constrain behavior because they understand the risks in that area, and you need to constrain for those risks because they're very dangerous. On the other hand, you may need something like innovation, which is something we like want to have come out of Catalyst. It's not so much that we want it to be a risk-free environment. We want innovation to come out, which means we need to take on a certain amount of risk. Those people are going to be operating in like this liberty spectrum. They're going to be operating in a much different spot. This challenge of legitimacy is saying at any given spot, when you look at any agent in the system, do they have, you know, the liberty to be where they need to be on the spectrum, the equality to be recognized as different and yet treated the same within the system, and then to have the agency to say, I can decide how I'm going to do this, and I can decide like what the outcome is. I can decide what goal I want to pursue in this system. All of that is contained in this concept of, is it legitimate or not? And that is so complex. That's so hard to break down.
Mm-hmm. But just as you were speaking, lots of S3 kind of principles came to mind around equivalence and transparency and effectiveness and all of that, especially around agency and being able to go. Like one of the principles is bias towards action unless there's a reason not to. And that's why we do consent, is we check an idea against the community and people can come up with legitimate, like, did you think about this? Or here's a valid improvement that I think is there to make it even better. And it's a way of kind of collecting that collective wisdom before we make a decision. But it's also like very consciously saying, in this area, we've kind of delegated kind of that responsibility. So you have the ability to move fast and make your own decisions, get consent or get advice when you need it, but do what you think is best, because we're delegating this down to this specific role or subcircle or even individual. Yeah. Ken, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, with the equivalence thing is what I've been thinking about. It sort of ties in with the balance between trying to do things at a top-down level and building things up from a grassroots level. So if you're talking about things where, like with equivalence, the idea is that you involve people in the decision-making process when the thing affects them. And so I think being able to determine that distinction between things that affect everybody in the ecosystem and things that can be localized that can affect just a subsection of the system. I think there needs to be some way of making that distinction, because if there's something that can be localized to a subset of the community, then that maybe is something that should be seen as more of a grassroots thing. But if it's something that will affect everybody in the community, then that is more like when you have the whole idea of having a constitution is to have something that sort of secures rights for everybody in the ecosystem. And so I think that it should be limited to things that can't be done in a localized way, like things that, like if you're changing the protocol itself, like it's going to affect people's liberties. You give up liberty of being able to create ADA out of thin air so that you can have the liberty of something that consistently has value. And so like there's a trade-off there. You're giving something up for something that's better in a sense. So like there's, yeah, things that would affect everybody. I think you need to look at them differently than things that you can localize. Because one thing that I see as a liberty, I've talked about it before, is the freedom to opt out of something. And so if there's a way that the idea that you're looking at can be, like you can move from one way of viewing things to another way of viewing things. Like if you can have different experiments in the ecosystem, then that's better for most cases. But if it's something that changes how Cardano works as a whole, or changes something that affects everybody, then those are the things that you should probably limit the high level view of things, like the Constitution and stuff from. Yeah, that's my thought.
Thanks, Ken. Jeremy, you had your hand up for a bit.
Yeah, Ken anticipated all of the things I was going to say there. I was just going to mention like subsidiarity, the idea of the most local decision, right? The smallest group that can make a decision because they're the ones affected by it. There's no need to bring in any sort of top-down governance on that. Yeah, that's that. And then Ken covered everything else I was thinking.
Mhm.
What
Those are- Oh, go ahead.
what is yeah. I'm curious as to like what is the intersex like what is their background as far as like in relation, like what are their governance habits? Like, and do they kind of recognize that they have a governance habit? Like what does it look like based on what's come out now? Are they familiar with the sort of new paradigm? You know, and based on what it is now, do we think that an S3 or a new model will take root, or will it sort of be an older model? As a question.
Well, to be sure, intersect is in the bootstrapper's dilemma, right? Like you've got to start somewhere. This is the same with the interim constitutions. You got to start somewhere. You know, and then the idea is to build out legitimacy over time. The big thing that I think intersect does really well, as far from my perspective, and I'm just kind of watching in there, is they listen. They're doing a good job of listening. That doesn't always mean that they resolve what they're hearing, right? Because sometimes they haven't yet set up that, you know, that working group doesn't quite have its documents together yet or whatever. But they are listening. And if they can add in just that layer of prioritizing, resolving everything they hear, that everything that gets heard has some place to go. Everything that gets heard is logged. Everything that they deal with gets handled. Then legitimacy will build up over time. Catalyst went through this, right? I mean, I'm sure Danny can even speak to this part of it, that there's a lot of listening that goes on. I mean, just think about their email inbox, how full that thing must be, right? Because I mean, I must hand that thing out 3 times a day to like, oh, you have a problem, here's how you resolve it. Go send it. Go tag these people with a message. So that's a lot of listening over a long time. And what you're building up there is legitimacy. And that's what's nice about the sociocracy stuff, is it's specifically saying, here are some patterns for how to listen better and how to engage with what you just heard. Right. So this is like an objection. The objections are hard to hear, but here's the conditions within which not only can objections be welcome and be considered gifts, but we can quickly get them separated into, oh, that's an objection where the objector needs information. We need to get that information to them. Oh, that's an objection where we need to start working on changing the structure itself in order to accommodate this information, probably from the edge, that the central entities don't have, that says, oh, this part of the structure isn't functioning. It's like, not, we thought we built a leg down into the soil to hold us up. It's in quicksand. It's sinking fast. So, and we need the information from the people that live there to tell us that. So yeah, I think Intersect's off to a good start. It feels like it's sort of galumphing along, you know, turning over slowly, but it's actually pretty quick, I think.
Yeah, I was going to say something similar. I think that Intersect is gaining speed, is gaining scale. There's every day there's more people involved, and I guess that they have in the dilemma of actually being very executive and very fast and making some of the things happen, and that not always you have the time or the resources to take in a very legitimate and decentralized way. It's just pushing along, pushing forward, and then try to bring more people and more voices into every decision as you go along. So I've seen it evolve over the time that I've been involved there, and I do think that there's good spirit and good intention on everyone involved in trying to make it every time, every day, more inclusive and more diverse and more participatory. There's a cultural evolution. There's a cultural clash, because of course there are expectations from many organizations that don't work that way. They work in a traditional corporate centralized way, and some of the institutions are more accustomed to working with sociocratic principles or decentralized ways of working. So I guess there's also the cultural evolution that naturally has to take place when so many people come together. And there's also like the relationship that the rest of the community has with Intersect. I kind of see that every day more people is referring to Intersect as us, like us in Intersect, such and such. But there's still a lot of people that see Intersect that's, you know, somewhere out there in the stack. And then people fall into the us versus them paradigm. And it's just a matter of as we move forward, more people will get involved and more people will feel that it's actually the community's organization, and that will bring legitimacy, and that will be diversity, and ultimately the governance practices that we adopt as a group will end up being the reflection of what people expect in the long run. But it's a process, and I think it's moving along fairly fast. Should accelerate actually in the next 6 to 12 months, because there's a lot of things that will happen. Because Intersect only has 6 months existing, so in the next 6 to 12 months, I guess there could be a lot of things happening that will allow for everyone to actually feel more included.
Thanks, Jose. Those are really good points. And I think I would only add that Intersect is, like Jeremy said, going through their bootstrap problem, and they Intersect, the organization, the corporation, is a business. It has paid staff, full-time people working there. But Intersect, the MBO, is comprised of all of us community members and organizations that have joined it. So there are two kind of separate things that it's hard to, they get conflated, but there is this paid professional staff, and they've been bootstrapping. And now more and more they're trying to change from bootstrap mode to servant mode, where they're paid full-time, so they know they have the capacity. The community members on the committees and stuff aren't paid at the moment, and so they only can provide like 4 8 hours a month or something like that, and that's not a lot of time. So they're able to pair with Intersect staff who are paid to be able to get real work done. But really the community can bring their viewpoints, their opinions, their thoughts, and their staff on hand to help them realize some of these things. And as we get more and more of the community involved as it grows, it would be really great to see. I've seen that change myself, is they've gone from thinking of Intersect as the staff of Intersect to being more like their full-time support staff for Intersect. And that kind of energy shift has allowed the community to step into more and more roles and take on more and more things, which is a really great kind of next bootstrapping phase. And I'm looking forward to the AMM, where everything is legitimized through actual voting, and all the people that are trying to hurriedly put up all this scaffolding can finally go, okay, now we have fully legitimate elected people that can step in and take it to the third stage.
AMM is the annual membership meeting.
I thought it was like the automatic market maker. I was like, ooh,
Yeah,
what's
right.
that
I was
about?
like,
Nice.
I heard about that. I'm like, wow, we're
yeah,
gonna get some
yeah.
tokens going here.
Yeah, the AMM is the annual members meeting happening in Tokyo in October. So if you're in the area or want to show up, that's probably a really great place to meet other MBO members. And
There should be a place where like all the governance positions and all the governance bodies are not filled just by people showing up and getting, finger chosen, or just because they show up, they're given responsibilities. It will actually be an election to act from the community to actually choose the people who will be filling those spaces for the next period. So should give a little bit more of legitimacy and transparency and accountability to everyone there.
Yeah, that transparency is an important one. The so sociocracy kind of question here. Isn't there a name for the type of circle, like what they're trying to turn their professional staff into? I think there's a specific
it's called
name for that.
Support circle, I think.
Okay. And B, how are they double linking? Right? Because clearly that's a tricky thing to negotiate. But also to understand their role as just another agent in the overall MBO ecosystem. I would say one thing that helps with that doesn't get enough traction, that isn't heard enough, is that it's one member, one vote in Intersect. People, I think, get confused and think it's plutocratic there too, because there's been like votes that Intersect has helped facilitate or organize. People think that's an Intersect vote when it's actually an ADA vote.
Yeah,
and so I think there's a little bit of confusion about that.
Yeah, and that's a really good reason to get involved and become a member of Intersect, is your vote actually matters. If you don't hold a lot of ADA, you have the same vote as Charles. It's one person, one vote. And I think that's a huge change from the plutocratic system that we use in other parts of Cardano.
Yeah, and maybe addressing the question about the double linking is that really Intersect has not officially adopted sociocracy as a governance method. I don't think that actually any governance method has actually been formally and deliberately implemented. There are some, like, depending on which area of Intersect is it is not very big, but it's quite diverse, and so not every area and not every committee and working group works the same way. But some of the working groups and committees work more sociocratically and like incorporate sociocratic principles into some of the decisions. Some of them are more pure in that, and others kind of hybrid. So they kind of build up decisions and try to do it consent based up to the point like where they get stuck and then they vote, and otherwise just go directly to voting and that's it. And they're not even aware that sociocracy exists. So there will be an evolution, and I think that the more people that gets involved and that's actually familiarized with the sociocratic principles and see the value on it, the more probability of actually Intersect adopting that more widely and maybe more officially. Because it is hard. It takes work. It's longer to decide. It's time consuming and energy consuming to actually listen to everyone and take decisions consent based. And so you have to really know why would you want to do that. And we come from a culture in which we are usually just accustomed to voting. You know, if 181 vote and then you get 51%, then there's a decision, regardless of the 49% that are not in agreement. So that's one of the things that we actually need to show the organization why we should go with the extra work, with the extra hustle of going consent-based.
Yeah, and to follow on that, and this goes to like anybody that might be asking like why use sociocracy as a system. It doesn't have to be a system. It's about like this is something we're uncovering in our study groups in ODIN. This is like deeply based in collaborative practice of any kind. This is how human beings collaborate. And sociocracy pulls that to the surface. It gives names to things so that you can frame it and understand it. It helps organize things so that you can take a pattern-based approach of, I'm going to study this, I'm going to train in this, I'm going to learn that. And so you can get upskilled so you can do actual collaboration. It's just recognizing what I believe are natural elements of collaborative environments, especially these collaborative environments of the commons, where you have natural governance taking place all the time. The commons governs itself. It'll kick you out. It's not, the commons isn't about people. It's about people recognizing the value that exists within commons. So like the double linking question to me comes down to like, that's a pattern that you have from sociocracy that's helpful for thinking about how does information move between nodes in a network? And in particular, with like talking about intersect groups or you know, like you don't have to think of their administrative capacity as a service circle, but that's a useful lens to view it through, because then you understand how it's bounded. You understand what its limits are and what its potential is. Like what kind of differences could exist within that boundary, you know, legal, technical, maybe marketing or communication with the rest of the organization and things like that. So when I think about double linking, I'm wondering what natural connections does that service angle have that will help them do their job even better? And that seems to be just like communicate in the Discord, but what could that really be? Like what could that actually be in day-to-day practice?
Mm-hmm. And part of that is also an educational component to learn the patterns and figure out how they work. And maybe that's a good opportunity to introduce, like ODIN does have a Fund 12 proposal to explore all the patterns. Do you want to introduce that a bit, Newman?
Oh yeah. So you know, so just to dovetail into that discussion, that sociocracy 3.0 is, they make it very clear that it's not meant to be you know, taken as a full menu. It's really an a la carte, to use that analogy, is you pick and choose each pattern. The S3 community is really big and vibrant, and we as a group at ODIN, like as a driver, sort of accepted, it's like we want to get involved and practice and learn these things. And we've tried a couple of different experiments, and one that's really resonated is just a very simple learn, research, choose a pattern. Because of this a la carte sort of thing, there are these 79 patterns, and we choose a pattern, research that pattern, and then present the pattern. The others sort of facilitate and, you know, convene a meeting. And we thought, like, and it's really been great. We're kind of we're kind of hungry for these you know, few minute to 30-minute pattern presentations. And we thought, hey, this would be a great way to have a proposal. And so we put out this proposal to open the study group to anyone to participate. Anyone can choose a pattern or some governance topic, like a principle or pluralistic voting, quadratic voting, or some other voting system, or any kind of governance principle, to sort of help us give, just like what Jeremy said, give language to these patterns of human collaboration, and then work with them, discuss them, and then ultimately build a resource for others to use and go on the same learning journey. So it's a really cool and simple project. It's not very much money. It's just over the minimum. I think it's 1,620 to 16,200 ADA. And I really hope that it gets funded. It's a pretty cool thing. It's a pretty cool thing that we've been doing, and hopefully we'll get funded. So I'm asking for your vote. Please look it over, give comments and suggestions, and then look for us in the voting app.
All right, thanks. Probably a good point to wrap things up. We're a little bit too big of a group to do a checkout round. That's one of the things we do in Sociocracy, is kind of see how things are landing for people. But I'd love to open it up just for a popcorn style. Anybody have any final thoughts around S3 and constitutional process, things like that, or what you took away from today? It would be great just to get a few voices in, and then we can close this up.
I have like a small concern. I mean, I am actually enjoying S3 and understanding it quite a bit, but my concern comes from my personal life. It's almost like at this point we are like, you need to have faith to find God. So right now we are in that stage where we need to have faith in S3 and assume it works, and then we'll know. So I'm still a little bit, I'm waiting for it to like actually work and see it work to like feel 100% confident. Yeah.
So sure. Any other final thoughts, checkout bits from anybody?
Hey guys, yeah, I just want to thank you guys for looking at this from a fresh pair of eyes, just going straight to the science that's out there, and finding solutions, finding points of views, bringing them to the table, and hosting this space here. I think that's very much what we need to step out of the echo chamber. So congrats for putting this together. And now I only knew today, almost like yesterday, James mentioned it on the playground. Today, Roberto said the session would happen, and yeah, I'm a big fan of you by now. So congrats, and I'll be in touch as well, because I am also a DREP pioneer. So I'll be reaching out to Newman or to someone to try to be on our workshop. But yeah, thanks.
Awesome, thanks, Lucas. And if this kind of conversation is interesting, ODIN does have weekly community meetings. We have a wide open once a month meeting that's coming up, I think, next week on Thursday. We meet on Thursdays. So check out our link tree. You can see more about what we're about. We have a Discord server that's fairly active on different topics. And S3 is one of the things we talk about, but there's a whole bunch of stuff going in there around how to collaborate and work together as a network of innovation. That's kind of our passion. So yeah. Any other final thoughts? If not, I want to say thanks everybody for coming to this breakout.
Thank you, everyone.
Yeah.
Have a nice week.
Thanks.
Bye.
Thanks, Nori.
Great week.
Bye.
Bye.